Jacques Lacan, écrit on a question prior to any possible treatment of psychosis. This article contains the most important material from the seminar I gave during the first 2 terms of the 1955 to 1956 academic year. The material from the 3rd term thus having been excluded. It was published in volume 4 of La Psychanalyse. Hoc quod quinta tres per annos in ipso loco studiui, e sanctae anae genio loci, e dilectae juventuti, quae io me sectata est diligenter dedico. 1. Toward Freud. 1. Half a century of Freudianism applied to psychosis has left the latter still to be reconceptualized. In other words, in statu quo ante. We might say that, prior to Freud, discussion of psychosis was unable to move beyond a theoretical framework that presented itself as psychology and was merely a lice-sized residue of what I will call the long metaphysical coction of science in the school, with the capital L our reverence owes it. Now, if our science concerning the physis, in its ever pure mathematization, retains from this cuisine no more than a stench so subtle that one may legitimately wonder whether a substitution of person has not occurred. The same cannot be said concerning the antiphysis, that is, the living apparatus that one hopes is capable of taking the measure of the said physis, whose smell of burnt fat indubitably betrays the age-old practice of preparing brains in that cuisine. Thus the theory of abstraction, necessary to account for knowledge, has become fixed in an abstract theory of the subject's faculties, which the most radical sensationalist question begging has been unable to render more functional with regard to subjective effects. The ever-renewed attempts to correct its results by the various counterweights of affect must, in fact, remain futile as long as one neglects to ask whether or not it is indeed the same subject that is affected. 2. This is the question one learns to avoid once and for all on one's school with a lowercase s bench, for even if alternations in the identity of the percipients are accepted, the latter's function in constituting the unity of the perceptum is not challenged. Thus, diversity of structure in the perceptum affects only a diversity of register in the percipients. In the final analysis, that of the sensoriums. This diversity is always surmountable, in principle, provided the percipience remains at a level of commensurate with reality. This is why those whose task it is to answer the question raised by the existence of the madman have been unable to stop themselves from interposing between it and them those same school benches, which they find, in this case, to be a convenient wall behind which to take shelter. Indeed, I would dare to lump together, so to speak, all positions on the matter, whether mechanistic or dynamic, whether they see the genesis of madness as based on the organism or the psyche, and its structure as based on disintegration or conflict. Yes, all of them, however ingenious they may be, insofar as, in the name of the obvious fact that a hallucination is a perceptum without an object, they confine themselves to asking the percipients to account for this perceptum, without realizing that, in doing so, they skip a step, that of inquiring whether the perceptum itself bequeaths a univocal meaning to the percipients who is asked here to explain it. This step should nevertheless seem legitimate in any unbiased examination of verbal hallucination, in that the latter is not reducible, as we shall see, to any particular sensorium, and especially not to any percipients insofar as percipients would give it its unity. Indeed, it is a mistake to take verbal hallucination to be auditory in nature, when it is theoretically conceivable that it is not to be auditory at all. In the case of a deaf mute, for example, or of some non-auditory register of hallucinatory spelling out of words. But above all, if we consider that the act of hearing is not the same when it aims at the coherence of the verbal chain, namely, its overdetermination at each instant by the deferred action après coup of its sequence, and the suspension at each instant of its value upon the advent of meaning that is always susceptible to postponement, renvoi, and when it adjusts to sound modulation in speech for the purpose of acoustic analysis, whether tonal or phonetic or even of musical power. These highly abbreviated remarks would seem to suffice to bring out the different subjectivities we must consider when investigating the perceptum, and the extent to which they are misunderstood in patient interviews and the nosology of voices. But it might be claimed that we can reduce these differences in subjectivity to levels of objectification in the percipients. This is not so, however, for it is at the level at which subjective synthesis confers upon speech its full meaning that the subject manifests all the paradoxes to which he falls victim in this singular perception. The fact that these paradoxes already appear when it is the other who prefers speech is sufficiently manifested in the subject by the possibility of obeying the other insofar as the latter's speech orders him to listen and to be on guard. For by simply listening in, the subject falls under the sway of a suggestion from which he can only escape by reducing the other to being no more than the mouthpiece of a discourse that is not his own, or of an intention that he sets aside in his discourse. But more striking still is the subject's relation to his own speech, in which what is important is somewhat masked by the purely acoustic fact that he cannot speak without hearing himself. Nor is there anything special in the behavior of consciousness about the fact that he cannot listen to himself without becoming divided. Clinicians did better when they figured out that verbal motor hallucinations are often accompanied by the subject's own partial phonatory movements. Yet they did not articulate the crucial point, which is that, since the sensorium is indifferent in the production of a signifying chain, A, the signifying chain imposes itself, by itself, on the subject in its dimension as voice. B, it takes on, as such, a reality proportionate to the time which is perfectly observable in experience, involved in its subjective attribution. C, and its own structure, qua signifier, is determinant in this attribution, which is distributive as a role, that is, it has several voices and thus renders equivocal the supposedly unifying percipients. 3. I will illustrate what I have just said with a phenomenon taken from one of my clinical presentations from 1955 to 1956, the very year of the seminar whose work I am presenting here. Let us say that such a find can only be the reward for complete, albeit enlightened, submission to the patient's properly subjective positions which are all too often forced by being reduced in the doctor-patient dialogue to the morbid process, thus increasing the difficulty of fathoming them due to a not unjustified reticence on the subject's part. It was a case of one of those shared delusions de les radeux, the typical case of which is the mother-daughter couple, as I showed long ago, in which a feeling of being intruded upon that had developed into a delusion of being watched was but the development of the defense characteristic of an affective binary relation, open as such to every alienation. It was the daughter who, during my examination, presented me, as proof of the insults to which she and her mother were subjected by their neighbors, a fact concerning the boyfriend of their female neighbor who was supposedly harassing them with her onslaughts, after they had to break off an intimate friendship with her that was at first kindly received. This man, who was thus an indirect party to the situation and, moreover, a rather secondary figure in the patient's allegations, had, according to her, flung at her the offensive term "sow" as he passed her in the hallway of their apartment building. On hearing this, and being hardly inclined to see in it a retort to pig, that would be too easy to extrapolate in the name of a projection which in such cases is never anything more than the psychiatrist's own projection, I asked her straight out what in herself had been proffered the moment before. Not in vain, for she conceded with a smile that, upon seeing the man, she had murmured the following words which, if she is to be believed here, gave no cause for offense. "I've just been to the pork butcher's." At whom were the words aimed? She was hard-pressed to say, giving me the right to help her. For their literal meaning, we cannot neglect the fact, among others, that the patient had suddenly taken leave of her husband and her in-laws, and thus given a marriage her mother disapproved of, a conclusion that had not changed in the interim, due to the conviction she had formed that these contrary bumpkins were planning nothing less, in order to finish off this good-for-nothing city girl, than to carve her up piece by piece. But what difference does it make whether or not one has to resort to the fantasy of the fragmented body in order to understand how the patient, a prisoner of the dyadic relationship, was responding once again here to a situation that was beyond her? For our present purposes, it is enough that the patient admitted that the sentence was elusive, even though she was unable, for all that, to demonstrate anything other than perplexity over which of the two people present or the one person absent, was targeted by the illusion. For it thus appears that the I, as subject of the sentence and direct speech, left in abeyance in accordance with its function as a shifter, as it is called in linguistics, the designation of the speaking subject for as long as the illusion, in its conjuratory intention, no doubt, itself remained oscillating. After a pause, this uncertainty came to an end with the apposition of the word "sao," itself too loaded with invective to follow the oscillation isochronously. This is how the discourse managed to realize its rejecting intention in the hallucination. In the locus where the unspeakable object was rejected into the real, a word made itself heard because, coming to place of what has no name, it was unable to follow the subject's intention without detaching itself from it by the dash that introduces the reply, opposing its disparaging antistrophe to the grumbling of the strophe that was thus restored to the patient with the index of the eye, resembling in its opacity the exclamations of love, when, running short of signifiers to call the object of its epithalamion, it employs the crudest imaginary means. "I'll eat you up, my sweetie. Shoo. You'll love it, you dog, you rat." 4. I mention this example here only to show in a real-life case that the function of unrealization is not entirely located in the symbol. For in order for its eruption, in the real to be incontrovertible, the symbol need but present itself, as it commonly does, in the form of a broken chain. We also see here the effect that every signifier has, once it is perceived, of arousing in the percipients an assent composed of the awakening of the percipients' hidden duplicity by the signifier's manifest ambiguity. Of course, all of this can be considered to be a mirage from the classic perspective of the unifying subject, but it is striking that this perspective, reduced to itself, offers only such impoverished views regarding hallucination, for example, that the work of a madman as remarkable as Judge Schraber proves to be in his memoirs of my nervous illness, after being well received, even before Freud, by psychiatrists, can be regarded, even after Freud, as a text worth reading as an introduction to the phenomenology of psychosis, and not simply for beginners. This work provided me with the basis for a structural analysis in my 1955 to 1956 seminar on Freudian structures in the psychoses, when, following Freud's advice, I re-examined it. The relation between the signifier and the subject that this analysis uncovers can be found, as is apparent in this preamble, in the very appearance of the phenomena, provided that, coming back to it from Freud's experience, one knows where it leads. But, if properly carried out, an approach that starts from the phenomenon leads back to this point, as was the case for me when my initial study of paranoia 30 years ago brought me to the threshold of psychoanalysis. Nowhere, in fact, is the fallacious conception of the psychical process in Jasper's sense, in which a symptom is merely an index, more relevant than in dealing with psychosis, because nowhere is the symptom more clearly articulated in the structure itself. assuming one knows how to read it. This makes it incumbent upon us to define this process by the most radical determinants of man's relation to the signifier. 5. But we need not have reached the stage to be interested in the variety of forms verbal hallucinations assume in Schreber's memoirs, or to recognize in them differences quite other than those by which they are classically classified, according to the way they involve the percipients, the degree of his disbelief, or the latter's reality, auditivation, namely, differences that stem instead from their speech structure, insofar as this structure is already in the perceptum. If we consider the text of the hallucinations alone, a distinction immediately arises for the linguist between code phenomena and message phenomena, belonging to the code phenomena. In this approach are the voices that use the Grundsprache, which I translate as basic language, langue de fond, and which Schreber describes as a vigorous, though somewhat antiquated German, which is especially characterized by its great wealth of euphemisms. Elsewhere, he ruefully refers to its form, which is authentic on account of its characteristics of noble distinction and simplicity. These code phenomena are specified in locutions that are neological in both their form, new compound words, though the compounding here takes place in accordance with the rules of the patient's mother tongue and usage. Hallucinations inform the subject of the forms and usages that constitute the neo-code. The subject owes to them, for example, first and foremost, the term Grundsprache that designates this neo-code. We are dealing here with something fairly akin to the messages that linguists call autonomous, insofar as it is the signifier itself and not what it signifies that is the object of the communication. However, this peculiar but normal relation of the message to itself is redoubled here, in that these messages are taken to be borne by beings whose relations are enunciated by the messages themselves in modes that prove to be quite analogous to the connection between signifiers. The term Nervenahung, which I translate as nerve annexation, and which also comes from these messages, illustrates this remark insofar as passion and action between these beings are reduced to those annexed or disannexed nerves, but also insofar as these nerves, just like the divine rays, Gottesstrahlen, with which they are homogeneous, are nothing but the identification of the spoken words they bear, which the voices formulate as, "Do not forget that the nature of the rays is that they must speak." This is the system's relation to its own constitution as signifier, which should be filled under the question of meta-language, and which, in my opinion, demonstrates the impropriety of this notion if it is intended to define elements differentiated within language. Let us note, on the other hand, that we are presented here with phenomena that have mistakenly been called intuitive due to the fact that the effect of a signification anticipates the development of signification therein. What is actually involved is an effect of the signifier, insofar as its degree of certainty, second degree signification of signification, takes on a weight proportional to the enigmatic void that first presents itself in the place of signification itself. What is amusing in this case is that it is precisely to the extent that the signifier's high tension drops for the subject, that is, that the hallucinations turn into refrains, mere repetitions whose emptiness is imputed to beings devoid of intelligence and personality, or who are even altogether effaced from the registers of being. It is to this very extent, as I was saying, that the voices highlight the Seelenauffassung, the soul conception. In the basic language, this conception is manifested in a catalogue of thoughts that is not unworthy of a conception of a book of classical psychology. This catalogue is tied to pedantic intention on the part of the voices, which does not stop the subject from making highly relevant comments on it. Note that the source of terms is always carefully referenced in these comments. For example, when the subject uses the word instance, he emphasizes in a note, "This expression is mine." This is why the primordial importance of memory thoughts, Erinnerungsgedanken, in the psychical economy does not escape him, and he immediately offers proof of this in the poetic and musical use of modulating reprise. Our patient, who provides the priceless description of the soul conception as a somewhat idealized representation which souls had formed of human life and thought, thinks that he has gained insight into the nature of human thought processes and human feelings for which many a psychologist might envy me. I would agree all the more readily in that, unlike them, he does not imagine that he has wrested this knowledge, whose scope he assesses so humorously, from the nature of things, and in that, while he thinks that he must make use of it, it is, as I have just indicated, on the basis of a semantic analysis. But to return to the thread of my argument, let us turn to the phenomena that I will contrast with the preceding ones as message phenomena. The latter are interrupted messages, by means of which a relationship is sustained between the subject and his divine interlocutor, a relationship to which the messages give the form of a challenge or an endurance test. Indeed, his partner's voice limits the messages in question to the beginning of a sentence whose complement of meaning poses, moreover, no problem to the subject, except for its harassing, offensive character, which is usually so idiotic as to discourage him. The valiance he displays by not faltering in his reply, and even in eluding the traps he is led into, is not the least important aspect for our analysis of the phenomenon. But I will dwell here again on the very text of what might be called the hallucinatory provocation, or better, protasis. The subject gives us the following example of such a structure. 1. Nun will ich mich, now I shall. 2. Sei sollen namlich, you were to. 3. Das will ich mir, I shall. To take only these 3, to which he must reply with their significant supplement, which to him is not open to doubt, namely, 1. Resign myself to being stupid. 2. Be exposed, a word of the basic language, as denying God, as given to voluptuous excesses, not to mention other things. 3. Think about that first. One might note that each sentence is interrupted at the point at which the group of words that one might call index terms ends, the latter being those designated by their function in the signifier, according to the terminology employed above, as shifters. That is, the terms in the code that indicate the subject's position on the basis of the message itself, after which the properly lexical part of the sentence, in other words, the part that includes the words the code defines by their use, whether it is the shared code or the delusional code, remains elided. Aren't we struck by the predominance of the signifier's function in these two orders? Of phenomena, and even incited to seek what lies at the root of the association they constitute, that of a code constituted by messages about the code, and of a message reduced to what in the code indicates the message. All this would have to be carefully transcribed onto a graph, the graph with which I have tried this year to represent the signifier's internal connections, insofar as they structure the subject, for there is a topology here that is altogether different from the topology we might be led to imagine by the requirement of an immediate parallelism between the form of the phenomena and their pathways in the central nervous system. But this topology, which follows the lines laid down by Freud when, after opening up the field of the unconscious with dreams, he set out to describe the dynamics of the unconscious without feeling bound by any concern for cortical localization, is precisely what may best prepare the questions we should ask when investigating the surface of the cerebral cortex. For it is only after linguistic analysis of the phenomenon of language that one can legitimately establish the relation it constitutes in the subject, and at the same time delimit the order of machines in the purely associative sense. This term takes on a network theory in mathematics that can bring about this phenomenon. It is no less remarkable that it was the Freudian experience that led the author of these lines in the direction presented here. Let us examine, then, what this experience contributes to our question.